This is the Convergent Science Network podcast. Leading researchers in the domain of neuroscience, brain theory, and technology are interviewed by Paul Verschure and Tony Prescott.
Paul Verschure here with the Convergent Science Network podcast, together with my colleague Tony Prescott. And we're speaking now with Christine Aicardi.
Yes.
Welcome to the podcast, Christine.
Thank you.
And Christine, you spoke this morning about, if you want, responsible research, right, and responsible innovation. So how would you define responsible research and innovation?
There are many definitions out there, and they don't all align. If I stick to the one that we have been trying to follow in the Human Brain Project, we are using the one proposed by the Engineering and Physical Research Science Council.
Engineering Physical Science Research Council.
Yeah, I always get the letters wrong. In the United Kingdom, which is more process-oriented, in that it proposed to anticipate, reflect, engage, act kind of area framework, where you are trying, when you're looking at an innovation process and new technology, to anticipate on the potential implications for society that this particular technology could lead to, that you analyze it and reflect on it with the scientists themselves, by bringing in as many perspectives as you can to bear on the topic, trying really to widen your inquiry to try to understand how this kind of narrow technological scientific development could pan out in society based on political, economic, social drivers out there. The engagement part is part with the scientists, part with seeking all those kind of complementary expert opinion on key sticky points you are going to identify while you are doing this kind of horizon scanning. And then the ACT part, which is, like I said this morning, the hard bit, closing the loop between anticipation and acting, which is getting back to the scientists with not necessarily normative frameworks or ethical frameworks belonging to any kind of schools, but with a bucket full of for the school of thought I come from, more empirical findings that are going to be things to bear in mind that matter, to think of when you are going on about your research. And acting accordingly, which for me is sort of dissociating between when you come into hard ethical problems, you are hardly ever going to resolve them on your own, otherwise they are not that big. But you can try to disentangle how much belongs to a policy layer, and that's a certain kinds of action with certain kinds of actors that can target the policy level. How much of it is about eventually doing some, I would say, bad word, lobbying, but really interacting with constituencies, civil society groups, different kinds of stakeholders, and make them aware of certain things you have found. And then the level of really, for me, one of the most interesting things for me as a researcher is going back to the level of the researcher themselves. So really, the level of the professional activity and the self-regulation of the professions. Because usually this is what, the researchers are at the cutting edge. They are at the forefront. And they are also at the forefront of a governance that is always lagging behind. So for me, this is a very important layer to try and address to various reasons.
So I think the area framework is kind of targeting sort of researchers themselves to think about what they're doing, why they're doing it, and so on. If we take sort of larger scale projects like the Human Brain Project, at what point do you think sort of this sort of push for individual action for researchers to take more responsibility for what they're doing, at what point do you need to complement that with, at the level of the project, some integrated approach to research governance that ensures delivery of the framework?
It's actually in the ACT part, because this is, for instance, what we saw because the very first thing we tackled as the Ethics and Society program of the Human Brain Project was the question of data protection and privacy, because it was a kind of burning issue in view of the research plans of the medical informatics platforms, and then became apparent that it was not just a medical informatics platform, but there was a lot of potential sticky point with animal data, with human data, and there was a need to sort of coordinate an entire governance strategy across the projects. And that's at this point that we sort of stepped up beyond the level of the individual researchers to also to advocate, for instance, for the creation of a job of data protection officer, which was basically not something that the Ethics and Society sub-project could decide on their own, but was something that needed the approval of first of the Science and Infrastructure Board of the project, of the Directorate, and eventually of the European Commission to accept that such a job was going to be created for the project and take up some of the funds of the coordination. So I would say that's some of the actions you can take. But one of the things I said this morning as well is that one of the main issue with this kind of projects is that when you find those kind of you identified those the things that would need action at a kind of higher policy level, so policymakers or other constituency. Because responsible research and innovation, or whatever you want to call it, is implemented at project level, it's sort of, I would say, to be really, for me to get teeth and become really effective, it should be at the level of entire research programs, and actually funders themselves should be submitted to responsible research and innovation practices when they define research programs, funding strands, etc. Because once the European Commission or the Research Council UK have decided that they are going to fund a number of particular strands of research, and they are going to push for a certain way of approaching, for instance, science with and for society, etc., etc., part of the frame is already set. So, and we are not asked as people trying to implement responsible research and innovation practices and to foster them to question the way into these research programs have been framed, into these projects, where these projects are fitting. And there is definitely, for me, a need to eventually go one step up, and for research councils and funders themselves to accept that they should themselves include this kind of reflective approaches in what they are doing.
So, I mean, it sounds to me that you're advocating something a bit more radical than maybe what has been implemented so far, because in terms of data management, for instance, in a way, that's a continuity with what has been traditionally seen as research ethics around sort of human participants, use of animals. Data management is a consequence of all this data we're now collecting and concerns about privacy. But the response to an innovation idea is as you say, it's anticipate. So there is something more proactive about RRI than is perhaps captured by these steps towards extending traditional ethics, if you like.
Yes. And since it's meant to be proactive and to anticipate, if you are entering something where a certain frame has already been defined and is already guiding research in many ways, and that this frame is not to be questioned, somehow this can get in the way of the way you anticipate and the way you can deploy actions is already constrained by this pre-existing frame of usually the research followers or the policymakers. So,
but if I understand you correctly, the model you're advocating is very much one of collective reflection and consensus, if I get it right. So, the most important aspect of responsible research, in other words, ethical research, is that all the participants, all the stakeholders, commonly reflect on the process of research. Is that correct? Would that be a summary?
That's right. Whether there is a consensus coming out of it is
secondary, but
is secondary.
Would be the goal to sort of at least exchange views.
Would be the goal. And sometimes I don't think you can always reach consensus. The idea that that's one of the things that is very present in the way responsible research and innovation is deployed, is that by this kind of participatory engagement, you reach consensus. You don't always reach consensus. And sometimes people just get antagonistic, and there is... And then you don't have mechanisms to resolve the disputes.
But now, if reflection then is the core value, right, of ethical research, at best it's a necessary condition, right? Because we can reflect collectively a lot, and we can all agree to build the world's most devastating poison gas, because that's what we believe needs to be done, which from the outside might look like a rather unethical decision, right? So how then is reflection actually of operational value? Because, in science, when we deal with questions of, if you want, truth in some sense, now we have the orthogonal perspective of right and wrong. And also scientists, of course, in the end have to make those decisions. Like, can I perform this this experiment on this animal? Is the payoff sufficiently justified to induce this kind of suffering? Or should I take an alternative approach? Like, these are the very concrete decisions that a scientist faces, in which they need guidance, right? So how does the reflection, if that's our core value, with its own limitations, as I just sketched, then help us as scientists to make better and more ethical decisions in how we pursue science?
I would say this kind of, for me, the diversity of views in being included in participation mechanisms might not necessarily aim for consensus. But I think that as many views as possible are always more valuable than thinking on your own. And in the case of, for instance, animal experimentations and on deciding, I think you are doing this research with one particular aim in mind. But then it might be interesting to bring into the process if an outcome is towards eventually doing some new medications or some new treatments, or I don't know what, to bring in the views of the patient groups might be implicated. I won't say animal activists, because you are going to know exactly what they are going to say. But in the end, I would say I do believe that scientists are sort of, most of the time behaving, they think about what they do. Sometimes they get too narrowly focused, which is why I really advocate for getting more views into the process, because sometimes it can trigger other ways of seeing things. But ultimately, it's going to be the scientists themselves with the help of their research ethics board, deciding whether they go for some kind of experimentation or not. What we have been doing, for instance, in this kind of the particular case in the Human Brain Project of data protection and all the data governance things.
Well, but that's another issue, right? I understand that.
But we're also setting up ethical checklist where people can go through the branches.
Yeah, but for me, that's a different discussion, because there we also face new regulation by the European Commission on management of personal data, which of course is very much driving that change. So I don't see that that's necessarily a good example if you look at responsible research, right? It's a bit a different topic for me. And what I was trying to get at, and also you said it now, in some sense, the fundamental premise of your approach is that in the end, humans know what is good. That's what you're saying, right? Scientists in the end will know what is good because they will think about what they do. And that seems a very strong assumption. Huh?
It's they know what they want to do. That's different. And I don't think they all want to do things that I think personally are good. But good and bad is very subjective.
But also people are put in cultural situations where it makes it difficult to act.
It makes very difficult to...
The way that it is difficult doesn't mean we shouldn't try to address it. Right? So that's why I gave you an example where I say, well, as a researcher, you must make ethical decisions on, are the expected results worth the suffering of this animal? As an example, right? That's a very concrete situation.
It's a very concrete situation.
And that's where people need guidance. Right? And then, so how would you go about providing guidance from a responsible research perspective?
It's really trying to exactly evaluate what are the expected benefits, and the expected,
So then you would say,
depending on the people you are going to talk to, no outcome is good enough to be worth an animal's life.
No outcome. If it saves the
for some people.
For some people. So that's what I mean. Right and wrong is very subjective and depending on culture and on cultural and beliefs. For some people, very little is going to be so.
But it doesn't solve.
It's not going to solve your problem. It's just going to give you, to help you get as many cards in your hands as possible about what are the benefits, what are the downsides, and so on and so forth. And eventually to give you an ethical training into thinking whether you're more, you buy into consequentialist ethics or virtue ethics or duty ethics. But as you know, ethicists from these different schools tend to kill each other over and don't see eye. So you can't even go to ethicists and ask them what they would do. So in the end, it falls onto your.
Well, but this is exactly where I want to get to, right?
But are you getting too much at the personal ethics? Because, it's, and I accept that the area framework maybe speaks to the personal ethical stance of researchers, but the challenge we really have is that we have a culture of science which puts people in a double bind situation where, having a job, being able to support themselves and their families puts them in a situation of having to do things which they may be ethically uncomfortable with. And so what you want to do is create a research culture that doesn't create the situation for people. So it has to be at the level of the organization that you, well, no, it's you can't avoid these clashes entirely, but you can certainly, if you apply the area framework at the organizational level, then you should be able to create a culture which is different.
So the point is, I think, so what I was trying to get at, as we saw earlier, right? The core value of responsible research, as we now discussed it, was a reflection, right? And also we've seen that in reports to the European Commission.
Yeah.
And I was just saying, in the Wannsee conference, there was a lot of reflection on the final solution. So obviously, reflection as such is not enough. We have to insert certain priors into that discussion This might be human rights considerations. This might be one angle you can take, right? It might be more ideological, political, religious considerations, but there must be additional priors you insert in that debate, even though it's difficult. And that's the whole point, because it's difficult to want to deal with it, right? John F. Kennedy, remember, we go to the moon because it's difficult. So we kind of run away from it and just wave our hands and then diffuse responsibility. Say, oh, there's so many opinions in the room, we don't know what to do. No, the real problems are there. And so we must be willing to actually debate on foundational grounds, these fundamental challenges. And it also means that within research projects, we must have frameworks that define what's right and what is wrong. Otherwise, we're just wasting our time and running around in circles. So I'm saying reflection as your core value is not enough, as history has shown. We must go beyond that. And I don't give you an answer to what that should be, but I'm saying that's a debate we must have as responsible citizens and as responsible scientists. And I don't hear enough about that from ethics. And ethics hear a lot about the precautionary principle. Well, let's see what happens. That's not good enough anymore, because we can have runaway technology, the repercussions of which are irreversible. So we must have a much more proactive stance. That's what I'm arguing for. So I just wanted to feel out that domain, to say, great, I understand, but I feel it's not enough. And I feel we're losing the game if we insist on this wait and see, and let's give everybody a voice in the process approach. I think from an operational perspective, it has no value.
You can effectively, if you collectively, you can end up involving, that's the problem of participatory democracy and all this kind of, it's difficult to take decisions. What I find, that's where I sort of align with what you say, is that I agree that the ARIA framework is a lot about personal responsibility and thinking about your own work. But I think that when analyzed properly, it's all this process for me, and that's where I say it's a shame it's only implemented at project level, is that it also helps disentangling, where it's really something an individual scientist or lab head can take a decision about, being reasonably informed. But there are these kind of double-bind situations or impossible decisions to make where it should not be at the individual level, and where collective mechanisms do not exist and policy is lagging. And so that's where, we've seen it in the Human Brain Project a lot, is that you see things that should be done at a higher level than the project, in the way, for instance, the project officers are sort of running the project. But we don't have this mechanism by which we can go back one step up on saying, this is an unacceptable way and actually an irresponsible way to run a project. Like, for instance, this is a project that runs mostly on fixed-term contract researchers, postdocs, with a few PIs. And we are now in the third phase of the Human Brain Project, and they've never managed to have continuity of funding between two phases. That's a problem. And especially between the ramp-up phase and the SGA1, we had how many months? 6 months between the two. And how responsible a way is that to run a scientific project? When people don't get the money to pay their postdocs go away. And I saw just the review letter that was finalized last week, the report letter, saying, it's like, the reviewers and the European Commission are wondering why, and it's sort of alarmed that you haven't managed to spend all your budget in SGA1. It's like, so many people couldn't recruit for months. And then when we got finally the money, you still have to recruit because people have gone. So when I say, there are levels at the individual level, but then we are lacking. So, I'm part of the guinea pigs who are, sort of trying this kind of science within full society implementation of Horizon 2020.
So what the implication, that's what Tony mentioned earlier, right? This is an important one. I really like your example. you say there's no responsible research without responsible governance, right? And all the stakeholders in the governance process must then be part of the responsible research process. This is also what you're saying, right? And so no, I would, but in some sense, this is always an incomplete model because we work in there are hierarchies, and somewhere the hierarchy is closed, and there is no more overview at that level, right? So that means that is also best an approximation of how you might get to responsible research.
And there is also the issue that there are so many powerful lobbies with a lot of money to pay for lobbying that are influencing at the commission level, and that we are not going, neither you nor I, going to be able to do. You can't. So we are in a very imperfect world.
But we're in a position where, sort of a large amount of money has been devolved to a group of scientists, essentially, to manage themselves and manage their research, which is quite a privileged and in some senses unanticipated situation. Maybe sort of CERN and things have been in the situation.
And as Christine said, a big social experiment.
Yeah, exactly. So, and it seems to me that we do need to, as Paul said, think about different levels at which sort of research, responsible research can be considered. So there's the sort of question of what are our values and how do we agree some, even not necessarily consensus, but we at least look at our values and try and see which ones we care about. There's the question of what are the risks. So we need to anticipate the risks short and long term. And then there's the question of how do we have the right governance structures to ensure that we make decisions that are fitting with those values and address those risks. So, and do we have the right mechanisms in a project like the HBP to do all those things? Are there people who are thinking about values and looking for the right values to guide what we're doing? Are there people who are anticipating risks? I think there probably are, but maybe there doesn't seem to me, as an insider, I haven't seen that there's a framework that summarizes all this. Is there one?
Not really.
Right.
The problem is we have an entire framework that has become this kind of huge pipelines of processes and standard operating procedures. And one of, rightful critique you can address to the way all this is implemented is becoming a huge bureaucratic machinery. And in the process, you lose the view of the content. It becomes like an, ethics application exercise where you tick the right boxes. Then now you start having those kind of, there is a standard operating procedure and a kind of pipeline for everything, but it doesn't it never says anything about right or wrong. If the process has been respected, then you must accept the outcome. It's been garbage. Yeah, I used to be an engineer, so it's kind of garbage in, garbage out for me. So there is something missing. You can't just be happy saying if all the procedures in place and all the process has been respected, then you have to accept the outcome. That's
a good example again, because ethical values actually become especially important when your standard procedures don't work, right? When the standard procedures work, it means everything is as expected, and there's apparently no real challenges. But ethical principles come in when you have trade-offs, when you have conflicts, right? So this was where a whole procedural model can actually never solve that. Because different values have to come in, and these values must be defined in some way.
And what is terribly complicated is that there are so many disciplinary fields represented in the Human Brain Project that even the professional ethics of those various fields don't align at all between themselves. So you talk to the people who come from really the more informatics side, say, I've never had to fill an ethics application in my entire career. Yeah. It's like, why would I start now?
Yeah. But there's two things here, right? So on the one hand, Human Brain Project is a social experiment in science funding and or science organization. But maybe for the discussion on ethics and responsible research, is just one example we can look at.
It's one example.
There are many others, and it might not necessarily be the best example. Also, given the kinds of problems it has faced, actually, that have a lot to do with ethics from its inception to where it is now, right? So maybe it's also worth our while to look a little bit as the human as just a test case, a use case we can analyze, right? And I think an important issue is, of course, researchers come in all sorts of flavors, and there will be on one extreme those that are in a project of that kind because it gives them resource. And for the rest, and this is also what some people report, it's a great project, but it got my money. Okay. On the other extreme, you have people who are in that project because there's a more and more ideological objective. But that, of course, also means if you want these groups to reflect collectively that the frames in which they look at that process are so radically different, it might be very difficult to make much progress. Because also, if you look at the discussion on free will, where as an individual we must be able to make our decision based on a notion of good and evil and good and bad, there is a notion of reason responsiveness, right? So in free will, to be a moral decision maker, we must be able to monitor our own decision making. We must be able to reflect on those decisions, but we must be able to also explicitly externalize them. We must be able to point to the reasons behind what we do, right? And so in that collective where you have so many different perspectives on one project, it might be very difficult to come to a reason responsive analysis because the reasons are very different and maybe more implicit in one case, very explicit in other cases, right? So wouldn't that argue that this idea of let's reflect is actually, in some sense, the best we can do in a very bad situation?
It's the best we can do in the bad situation. And moreover, like you said this morning, the scenario I presented was extremely crude. But that's one of the few things, like, if we don't talk about this kind of practical questions, we don't even want to interact with you because you are wasting our time. So, so that's also part of, we are there. And for some people, we are there in the Human Brain Project in the same way that you are filling in an ethics application to get funding. So we are there, we get a bit of the money, but further than that, we do the ethics compliance. Some people among us do the compliance, so with the police of things. If we can help with the science communication, which we don't really, this is not really our work. I mean, I'm not a PR person, but then good. Otherwise, take as little space as possible and just don't waste our time. So there is also this kind of ill will that is very hard when there is already a lot of demand in a project which is so bureaucratized for all sorts of reporting and deadlines and stuff. And you come back adding like, oh, let's think about ethics. Like, I don't have time.
Right. There's another aspect.
Paul, we should wrap up because Christine has to get a flight. So maybe we could finish by, the Human Brain Project has been running for 5 years now. The Commission is about to launch into another round of flagships. They're going to fund some pilot studies for flagships in the next year. So what lessons could you summarize from 5 years of HBP for this next round of flagships? What should they do different?
For me, this next is, I would say, don't integrate all humanities, arts and social science into those big scientific projects, because that makes them, that frames them as being purely utilitarians, and it's not necessarily helpful. I would also say the way they have been evaluating the large flagships is very subjective, because they are social experiments, but never at any point in these 5 years has there been any social scientist involved in these projects mandated to actually monitor these projects as social experiments. So whatever conclusions are not drawn based on field work and qualitative research within the projects. And because it was all launched from the premise that this is the right model to address the big challenges. And like I said, when you are framed within a certain, this is a very constraining frame. So that's not questionable. But it's sort of questioned because now they are sort of saying we may be using a different, smaller flagship, blah, blah, and so on. Which means they are entirely satisfied with the way it's happened, but they haven't mandated any research to be done in the way it has happened. So I would say a bit more, take all this a bit more seriously and actually accept that even your own premises are questioned by whatever social science and humanities you inject into those and ethics you inject to those large projects. And yeah, and another thing is, it's all well and nice to create, work packages on sub-projects in charge of ethics and society, to which all these questions are sort of delegated. But if you don't give them teeth to actually go back to people who are not necessarily willing to interact and collaborate, and just like, I'm not interested and I don't want to work with you. We are powerless. So we end up like being unable to just go back to the action.
So, Christine, if I want to pursue responsible research, what should be Christine's law?
For me, it's always been, and that's my very partial judgment. I tend to be starkly critical of what I do and look back on it, and don't spare yourself. Well, I mean, self-reflection is also about really trying to step out and look at what we are doing as, do I have other motives than the ones I'm allowing myself to make explicit to myself?
Like know thyself. We're back in Delphi, right?
Yeah. So.
And the second then is, if you have to make a prediction that Tony will come and check in London 4 years from now on the state of the art and responsible research, what specific prediction would you like to see validated in a 4-year time frame? That's about by the end of the Human Brain Project.
By the end of the Human Brain Project. So far, what we have seen validated is that, is all the negative stuff. Is that when we told the medical informatics people at the beginning of the ramp-up phase that if they went on the way they were going, ignoring, consent and saying we are all going to anonymize, they were going to faceplant, and they sort of faceplanted. Sorry, so that was.
That's a retrodiction.
Yeah, we told you so, which is not exactly satisfying.
Prediction now.
Prediction about the Human Brain Project.
No, about responsible research.
Responsible research. Like utopian or realistic? Anything I want.
Tony will come and check it 4 years from now.
4 years from now, I think it will have changed names.
Okay. Very good. Okay, Christine Aicardi, thank you very much for this conversation.
Very cool. Yeah.
The CSN podcast was produced by the Convergent Science Network of Biomimetics and Biohybrid Systems, a project funded by the European 7th Research Framework Programme. For more interviews, recorded lectures, or upcoming conferences in the field of biomimetics and biohybrid systems, go to csnnetwork.eu. And thank you for listening.